Thank you for joining me for this brief discussion on the rhetorical tradition, a look beyond the speech. I first became interested in the roots of the tradition and the theories within because public speaking is something that I do on a fairly regular basis. And whether I'm teaching a kindergarten classroom of Sunday school students, or I'm speaking at a teenage retreat or a women's conference, or whether it's a classroom full of undergraduate speech students, I want to give them the best presentation that I possibly can. And so I started focusing in on the foundational aspects of oration and specifically studying the influence of Aristotle's three proofs of rhetoric: logos, which is sound reasoning; ethos, which is credibility; and pathos, which is this balanced emotional appeal. Interestingly enough, as I began to research these foundational pillars, I found that the theorists within the tradition are quite a divided lot. Many of them still hold that the ancient tradition is valuable and it's an unbeatable guideline for successful speech making. This is known as the traditional tradition. However, there are others who would rather see this ancient tradition done away with, in particular, the tradition piece of pathos or emotion, and this is known as the new tradition. So today we're going to hear from several theorists on either side of the coin. We'll also discuss the difficulty this division brings to actually defining the rhetorical tradition. But first, let's just begin with a bit of history. While Aristotle is certainly known as the father of rhetoric, it was actually the sophists who were the first teachers of communication. These are 5th century BCE ancient Greek teachers of argument, particularly in the court of law. Now, Plato came along and he was an antagonist of the sophists. He criticized their teaching of communication. He said that it was much too relative. Plato was a firm believer in absolutes, and therefore he tried to dismiss rhetoric altogether as just mere flattery. Ironically enough, it was his student, Aristotle, who saw rhetoric as more of a pragmatic philosophy. He cared about it, and therefore he created these three proofs, logos, ethos, and pathos, that we're talking about today. Aristotle's lectures were then archived into what we now call the rhetoric, and it was from these that Roman philosophers, theorists, and politicians like Cicero took them, they adopted them, they adapted them, and they made them even more efficient for their empire. Later still, we see a teacher of rhetoric who left the classroom for the church, and he took these same proofs, these pillars, and he taught them to his young preachers in an effort that they might delight and move their audience. So the next time you hear a very engaging sermon, you can think St. Augustine. But it wasn't just individuals who had a play in this development or this change within the rhetorical tradition. We see changes coming in across time periods as well. For instance, in the Middle Ages, the rhetorical tradition took a more pragmatic approach. They focused in on the art of letter writing, specifically symbol, style, and adapting to your audience. Then the Renaissance saw more of a philosophy made of the tradition. Humanists became quite excited about the power of the word and the power that word had to transform the world. You could say that humanists were the first social constructionists. During the Enlightenment, then, rationalism made its appearance. With the likes of René Descartes and Sir Francis Bacon, the rhetorical tradition went through a difficult period, a period of battering, again, much like it did with Plato. With knowledge and logic being the rule of the day, there was just very little room for an even layer of pathos or emotion. Now that we moved into modern day, we see perhaps the greatest transition of all for the rhetorical tradition. It went from being known as effective speech-making to now including every kind of human symbol. And it's because of this vast array of materials that it has to work with that it has become so difficult to define. As I've already mentioned, there are primarily two different camps in the rhetorical tradition, essentially the old and the new. But even within these two arenas, there's still even more division. One theorist, John Murphy, suggests that there's three different views instead of two. One view, of course, is the new tradition. This view is the one who says there's not a lot of room for the ancient proofs or the ancient texts. They're seen as continuous, comfortable, complacent. Simply, they're just out of date. The second view is the traditional tradition. This view clings to the ancients and their wisdom. Theories within this view believe that the interpretation of past rhetoric is what will give us the ability to produce future rhetoric. And then the third view is different altogether. It's pluralistic, it's liberal in its scope, and this view is characterized by phrases like anything goes, or this is a marketplace of ideas, or no one's opinion should be turned away. It's no surprise then with all these differing views to hear what theorists are saying about actually being able to come up with a definition of the rhetorical tradition. Andrea Rittervoice argues that the rhetoric has borrowed so much from philosophy that it's struggling to find its own identity. She says that it's fraught with unanswered questions, loose ends, unresolved contradictions, tentative connections, and underdeveloped concepts. In essence, it might be impossible to define. Patricia Bizzell reminds theorists that just because you may not want to use the ancient tradition in your own speech-making, that does not mean that you can ignore it. You have to respect the fact that we've been given these historic texts, we've been given these ancient pillars, and they are part of our history. Richard Graff is a theorist who is all for modernizing things. He allows for some diversity, but he retains that we have to have a source of tradition to maintain some kind of identity. Yet Elise Portnoy asks, how can we have a singular identity when every time the tradition changes with whoever defines it, uses it, or challenges it? So clearly these theorists show their difference of opinion on how the definition should come about, but there is one thing they agree on. If the rhetorical tradition is going to be defined, if this is going to actually happen, it will be because we've maintained the conceptual core of the ancient legacy of the rhetorical tradition. The problem is, there are just as many theorists who disagree. Theorists Raymond Williams and Ramey McCarrow are two who have expressed their skepticism in the ancient tradition. They believe that to hold strongly to the past is to pre-shape the present. You're forcing past ideas on future rhetoricians, and that's not fair. One stated that the dead hand of the past smothers any possibility of conceptual space. That statement certainly leaves little room for interpretation. Carol Blair is another theorist who has made her opinion known in her essay Contested Histories of Rhetoric. She says that preserving the ancient tradition to use it in the present, you're just doing that in vain. Because perspective has changed over time, therefore the method should change as well. With these words of skepticism come a few words of warning, however. Graff, again, and his colleagues point out that the rhetorical tradition is so fractured. There's so many different ideas sprouting off in every direction. If we don't have a tradition against which we measure all of this newness, we will lose our academic standing. And Donald Bryant chimes in specifically on the elimination of pathos, and he says the separation of thought from emotion is a plague in our tradition. The good news is that for every theorist against the ancient tradition, there is another who's embracing it, and this started with the ancients themselves. Augustine, as I mentioned before, taught the three pillars of rhetoric to his preachers, and he taught them that logos without pathos is of very little value, but pathos without logos is just simply a nuisance. Therefore, we have to understand that it's a both and, not an either or. In the Enlightenment, when there was such a great separation between knowledge and its presentation, the elocutionists came along and did their part to kind of restore that relationship. They studied the effects of a well-delivered speech on the audience, so we can see that pathos mattered then, and it matters now. Even England's national poet, William Shakespeare, was affected by Aristotle's rhetorical proofs. In a recent article, Joel Benaboo showed the connection between Aristotle's rhetoric and William Shakespeare's inarguable gift in being able to produce a stunning open scene. He says there's no doubt that Aristotle's influence and instruction on keeping those three pillars together and using them together every time is what led to a lot of Shakespeare's success as a playwright. And this continues today. The defense from modern day traditionalists continues. Authors Brian Vickers and Mortimer Adler are just two examples. They believe in the ancient pillars and they teach the ancient pillars to their future orators. They believe that there's no more full or complete guideline to successful speech-making than that of Aristotle's rhetoric. And within that, they believe that logos, without pathos, will be highly unsuccessful. These pillars, very clearly, were never meant to stand alone. Therefore, It is my finding that, in agreement with the founders of the tradition, as well as with the rehabilitators of the classical formula, one must maintain equal parts intellect, credibility, and emotion to successfully practice the art of speech making. Thank you so much for joining me for this brief discussion. I hope that it's been an encouragement to you as you continue your studies in communication theory, and specifically in the art of speech making and writing. Be blessed as you continue to learn, grow, and communicate. Thank you for your time.